Sometimes, the greatest lessons in life don't come from wealth, power, or fame, but from the smallest, purest hearts among us. Today, you'll hear the story of a billionaire brought to his knees by a moment of humiliation, and a poor little girl who did the unthinkable, changing his life forever. Stay with us, and let this story touch your soul. Welcome to Kindness Breeze, where every story whispers the power of compassion. Edward Hayes wasn't just any man, he was a billionaire, a name that turned heads wherever he went. The world looked at him with admiration, envy, and sometimes even fear. People saw the cars, the private jets, the skyscrapers that bore his company's name. They thought he had everything: money, respect, and power. But what no one knew was the silent burden he carried inside. On this particular afternoon, Edward walked into a quiet cafe, dressed in his usual elegance. To the strangers around him, he was just another customer. For Edward, that anonymity felt like a breath of relief. He was tired of being treated like a walking bank. He wanted to feel ordinary, just a man craving a simple cup of coffee. He placed his order, smiled politely at the cashier, and handed over his sleek black credit card. He expected the usual nod of approval. Instead, the cashier frowned, typed again, and then whispered words Edward never thought he would hear in public. "Sir, I'm sorry, but your card has been declined." The words hit him like thunder. Declined? Impossible. He tried another card. Declined again. Heads started turning. Whispers filled the air. For the first time in years, Edward felt his face flush red with humiliation. He, the man whose name was synonymous with wealth, stood there helpless. It wasn't about the coffee anymore. It was about dignity. His mind raced. What if the news spread? What if someone posted a picture? Billionaire's card declined. His empire mocked in one viral post. He clenched his jaw, trying to hide the storm raging inside. What no one realized in that cafe was that Edward's wealth wasn't as secure as it looked. His companies were facing lawsuits, his accounts were frozen temporarily due to an investigation. He had walked in to escape stress, but now the walls of humiliation closed in tighter. For the first time in decades, Edward Hayes felt powerless. Not because he lacked money, but because no one in that room saw him as human, only as a fallen giant. And then, from the corner, a small pair of eyes watched him with something the others didn't: compassion. In that crowded cafe, where people were whispering and smirking at Edward's humiliation, there was one soul who wasn't mocking him. She wasn't shocked by the idea of a billionaire's card failing, nor was she eager to pull out her phone to capture the scene. Instead, she simply watched him. She was a little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. Her clothes were faded, her shoes a size too big, with tiny patches stitched on by hands that knew poverty too well. She sat alone at a small corner table, her hands wrapped around a crumpled paper bag that held her treasure, just a few coins she had been saving. Coins meant for one thing: her very first sandwich from this cafe. Life had already taught her what it meant to go hungry. She knew the sting of wanting something simple and not being able to afford it. For weeks, she had picked up small chores, cleaning steps, carrying bags for strangers, just to collect enough to taste that sandwich. To her, those coins weren't just money. They were dreams. But as she looked at Edward Hayes, the man everyone else was laughing at, she saw something far deeper than embarrassment. She saw loneliness in his eyes. She saw the kind of pain she had often seen in her own father's face when he couldn't bring food home. She didn't see a billionaire. She didn't see a man of power. She saw a human being, stripped of pride and silently breaking inside. And that is where her heart spoke louder than her hunger. The girl felt a tug deep inside her chest. A whisper telling her that kindness doesn't wait until you're rich, and compassion isn't measured in numbers. With trembling fingers, she reached into her paper bag, pulling out the only coins she had. She glanced at them, wondering if this was foolish, wondering if she would still walk away hungry. But her decision was clear. She stood up, her tiny frame almost invisible compared to the towering man at the counter. Step by step, she walked forward. Her little shoes squeaked softly on the cafe floor. The whispers stopped for a moment, all eyes shifting to her. And yet, she didn't care. Her heart was beating fast, but her courage was louder. She was about to do the unthinkable. The cafe had grown strangely quiet as the little girl approached the counter. Her tiny footsteps echoed louder than the murmurs that had filled the room just moments earlier. Edward Hayes, still frozen in humiliation, noticed the movement beside him. He looked down, expecting perhaps another critic, another stranger ready to lecture him about his so-called wealth. Instead, he saw her. A child, barely reaching his elbow, standing there with her small fist clenched tightly. She opened her hand slowly, revealing a few coins, dull, scratched, but shining with more value than any diamond Edward had ever owned. With trembling lips, she whispered words that would shake the billionaire's world to its core. "Sir, I can pay for you." The cashier blinked, confused. The room gasped. A billionaire, offered help by a child in rags. Some chuckled, thinking it was absurd. Others softened, unsure how to process what they were witnessing. But the little girl wasn't joking. She carefully placed her coins on the counter, each one sliding out of her palm as though she was giving away a piece of herself. Those coins were everything she had. The sandwich she had dreamed of vanished in that moment. Her own hunger didn't matter anymore, because her heart had chosen compassion over survival. She looked up at Edward with innocent eyes, her smile small but steady. Edward's throat tightened. His hands, used to holding million-dollar contracts and luxury watches, suddenly felt unworthy to even touch those coins. He knelt down, his towering figure bending before this tiny warrior of kindness. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Why would you do this for me?" The girl shrugged gently, her eyes glistening. "Because you look sad, and no one should feel sad over something small like coffee." Her words pierced him deeper than any business loss ever could. Around them, silence reigned. No one laughed anymore. No one whispered. They all simply watched, a billionaire humbled, a poor girl shining brighter than any wealth in the world. In that fragile moment, Edward realized that what she had done was not just kind, it was unthinkable. She had given away her everything to ease the pain of someone who, in her eyes, mattered just as much as she did. And for the first time in his life, Edward Hayes felt what true wealth really looked like. Edward Hayes knelt there, frozen, staring at the few coins scattered on the counter. His entire world, billions, skyscrapers, private jets, suddenly felt like dust compared to the shimmering worth of those simple coins. His chest tightened, and for the first time in years, his eyes blurred with tears he couldn't hold back. He looked at the little girl, and something inside him shattered. This child had nothing, yet she gave everything. She didn't care about his fame, his failures, or the whispers circling the cafe. She didn't care that he was supposed to be a billionaire. All she saw was a man, hurt, embarrassed, and in need of help. And in her small way, she had stepped forward when no one else dared to. Edward's mind raced back to his own childhood. He remembered being a boy with holes in his shoes, watching his mother skip meals just so he could eat. He remembered the sting of hunger, the heaviness of helplessness. Somewhere along the road of success, he had buried those memories, convincing himself that wealth had erased the pain of the past. But this little girl's act had dug it all back up. In that instant, he realized a truth he had forgotten: wealth is not counted in money, but in compassion. He gently placed his trembling hand on the girl's shoulder. His voice broke as he whispered, "You've just taught me more than all my years of business ever did." Around them, the cafe was silent, people no longer seeing Edward as the untouchable billionaire, but as a man broken down by the purity of a child's kindness. Even the cashier's eyes softened, holding back tears at the sight. Edward felt small, humbled, yet strangely whole. He understood now that no matter how many zeros he added to his bank account, he would never be as rich as this girl who had chosen generosity over hunger. And as he rose to his feet, holding the coins gently as if they were made of gold, Edward Hayes knew one thing with absolute certainty: his life could no longer stay the same. Edward Hayes walked out of that cafe a changed man. The coins from the little girl were still in his palm, their weight heavier than gold. Each one carried a lesson, a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness could break through walls that billions of dollars never could. That night, Edward didn't sleep. He kept replaying her words in his mind: "Because you look sad, and no one should feel sad over something small like coffee." Simple words, but they pierced deeper than any speech he had ever heard in boardrooms or conferences. He thought about how the world had mocked him in that cafe, how people had whispered behind his back, and yet it was the poorest person in the room who stepped forward when no one else did. The next morning, Edward did something he hadn't done in years. He searched for the girl. It took hours, but eventually, he found her home, a tiny broken-down apartment where she lived with her mother and younger brother. Their situation was worse than he had imagined. The girl's mother worked endless shifts just to keep food on the table. The little girl had been saving those coins for weeks, hoping to taste a sandwich while her brother slept hungry most nights. Edward stood there, tears threatening to fall again. This child, who had so little, had taught him the greatest lesson of his life. Without hesitation, he stepped into their world, not as a billionaire flaunting wealth, but as a human touched by kindness. He made a promise that day: he would sponsor her education, provide a safe home for her family, and ensure that hunger never stole her smile again. But beyond money, he promised himself something greater: that he would live differently. That he would use his wealth not just for power, but for people. Years later, when the girl grew up and became an educated young woman, Edward often told the story. Standing before audiences, he would hold up those same old coins, framed now, preserved forever, and say, "These are the richest things I own. They came from a little girl who reminded me that the poorest hearts often hold the greatest wealth." And from that day forward, Edward Hayes was no longer just a billionaire. He was a man transformed, because one poor little girl had done the unthinkable.